The roar of the crowd rolled like thunder across the track, shaking the grandstand and rattling the air with the rhythm of pounding hooves. The sun burned low over the horizon, casting the dirt in molten gold. And then, like the sudden snap of a rope under strain, it happened, a sound sharp enough to cut through cheers, sharp enough to silence thousands. A foreleg buckled. The great stallion stumbled, legs tangling, throwing up a spray of grit before pitching sideways. The noise of the race died all at once, replaced by a thin, horrified murmur. Dust billowed, hanging in the air as Valor's pride struggled to right himself. His eyes, wide and white-rimmed, darted in panic. He tried to stand, but the leg bent wrong, unnatural, impossible. People shouted. The announcer stammered into the microphone. Already, track officials were moving, rushing in with the green curtain, the one they only ever brought when things were beyond repair. At the far end of the rail, Ethan Cole stood with his hands locked around the brim of his hat, pressing it low against his brow as if to shut the scene out. But he couldn't look away. In the long shadow of 44 years, he'd seen more than his share of endings. Yet this was a different kind of cruelty. He had been a trainer once, in another life, before the fire took everything that mattered. A wife, an unborn child, the horses they'd raised together. He'd walked away from it all. Since then, he'd kept his work distant, mechanical, never let himself care. But when the stallion's gaze flicked toward him to the tangle of moving bodies, something in his chest shifted. Those eyes, wild, glazed with pain, yet searching, caught him like a hook. The vet's voice cut the air. The brakes clean through. He'll never race again. Best to put him down before nightfall. Owners in tailored coats stood off to the side, their murmurs sharp and cold. Not worth the cost, one said, as if the horse were no more than a worn-out piece of equipment. Ethan heard himself speak before he knew he'd decided. I'll take him. Heads turned. Someone snorted a laugh. Then another joined in, like it was a joke told out of place. The head owner stepped forward, voice flat. This isn't a pasture pet. It's a liability. You'd be paying for every bit of that risk yourself. Fine, Ethan said, the word landing like a stone. A clipboard appeared, paper thick with legal disclaimers. His signature scrawled across it, shaky but deliberate. Felt like an oath he didn't fully understand yet. By the time the curtain dropped, the stands had emptied. The track left to the settling dust and the sound of distant maintenance crews sweeping away the race as if it had never happened. Ethan walked beside Valor toward the trailer, each step a negotiation. The stallion's breaths came fast and shallow, sweat streaking his dark coat, his injured leg trembling under the weight of the simplest motion. Ethan kept his voice low. Easy now. The ramp creaked under the horse's weight. The hollow clang of hooves against metal echoed through the parking lot, sharp as gunfire. When the tailgate slammed shut, the sound reverberated in Ethan's ribs. Rain had begun to fall, thin needles tapping on the roof of the trailer. He climbed into the cab of his battered truck, the seat springs groaning under him. For a moment, he just sat, both hands gripping the wheel, watching drops race each other down the windshield. In the rear view, through the small window, he could just make out the stallion shifting, his head dipping low, eyes still restless. The engine coughed life, and the truck rolled forward, tires hissing over wet gravel. Street lights bled into the night behind him, giving way to the long stretch of rural highway. The wipers swept back and forth in a steady rhythm, marking time against the hum of the engine. Inside the trailer, there was a faint shuffle, the sound of hooves adjusting, a low breath like a question Ethan couldn't yet answer. He drove with the road unfurling black and slick ahead of him, every mile pulling them farther from the noise of the track and deeper into the quiet unknown. Somewhere in that darkness lay the answer to what he'd just done. He didn't know if the horse would make it through the night. He didn't know why he'd stepped forward when everyone else had stepped back. All he knew was that the decision was made, and there was no turning around now. Rain turned to sleep by the time Ethan reached the turnoff to his property, the road narrowing into a ribbon of black between pale, snow-cloaked fields. The truck's headlights swept over leaning fence posts and the skeletal shapes of bare trees. In the trail behind him, the stallion shifted again, the movement uneven, punctuated by the hollow thud of a hoof catching against metal. Each sound made Ethan's grip on the wheel tighten. The ranch appeared as a shadow cluster at the base of the hills, a weathered barn, its roof patched with rusted tin, and a squat house with one dim porch light burning. It had been years since another living creature besides himself had crossed its threshold. He backed the trailer up to the barn doors, the reverse lights casting his breath in clouds. The stallion resisted at first, head jerking, muscles taut with pain and fear. Ethan kept his voice low, steady, letting the lead rope hang loose in his hand. Easy, boy. Just a step at a time. Valor's pride, though the name felt strange to use now, lowered his head and took a tentative step onto the slick ramp, his injured leg trembling under the weight. The sound of hoof against wood was slow, deliberate, and each note seemed to carry the weight of a decision. Inside, the barn smelled of dust, old hay, and the faint tang of oil from tools long unused. Ethan had cleared one stall earlier in the year, though he'd never imagined it would hold a horse again. Fresh straw softened the floor. He guided Valor in, unfastening the rope only when the stall door clicked shut behind them. The stallion stood motionless for a moment, sides heaving, then lowered his head toward the water bucket. Dr. Winslow arrived not long after, stomping snow from his boots. The man was broad-shouldered and gray-bearded, with a manner that wasted neither words nor movement. He examined the leg in silence, fingers tracing the swelling, eyes narrowing at the angle of the break. "It's bad," he said finally. "Bad enough you'd be wise to think about the kindest way out." Ethan said nothing, only resting a hand against the stall door. Winslow sighed. "You'll need to keep him quiet. Stall rests for months. If he makes it, infection could take him in a week. And even if it doesn't, he'll never run again. You know that." "I know," Ethan replied. The vet cleaned and rewrapped the leg, left a list of instructions, and drove away into the sleet. Alone again, Ethan dragged an old chair into the aisle and sat, facing the stall. The light above was dim, casting the stallion's shadow long across the wall. Every so often, Valor's ears flicked toward him, as if testing the sound of another's breathing nearby. Night passed in slow fragments. Ethan dozed and woke, the cold settling into his bones. Each time he stirred, he checked the stallion, watching for the rise and fall of his flank, for the subtle shift of hooves on straw. Once, near dawn, Valor trembled and pressed against the wall, the pain clear in the strain of his neck. Ethan stood, stepping into the stall, laying a hand lightly against the horse's shoulder. "Easy now. You're here. You're safe." The words felt clumsy, but they held the steadiness his voice had not found in years. By morning, the sleet had stopped, leaving the world brittle and still. Sunlight slid between the barn boards, touching the straw in narrow gold bands. Ethan filled the feed bucket, mixing chopped apple into the grain. At first, Valor ignored it, nostrils flaring, but then he lowered his head, lips working slowly at the sweet pieces. The sound was quiet, almost shy, and Ethan found himself listening harder than he meant to. He mucked the stall in silence, the rhythm of the work anchoring him. Now and then he caught the stallion watching him, dark eyes calm but searching. Ethan knew enough to see it for what it was, a beginning fragile and small but alive. That night, as he settled into the chair again, the barn seemed less hollow. The steady sound of the horse's breathing filled the space between them. And for the first time since leaving the track, Ethan allowed himself to think they might both see another day. The snow receded slowly, retreating into the shadows of fences and tree lines, leaving the paddock a patchwork of thawing earth and shallow puddles. Weeks had passed since Ethan had brought Valor home, and the barn had settled into a quiet rhythm. The stallion's coat, once dull with sweat and dust, now gleamed faintly in the weak sunlight that filtered through the open door. His leg, bound in a clean wrap, no longer shook under the weight of standing. Progress was there, though measured in moments, so small most would have missed them. Ethan noticed everyone. Rehabilitation began cautiously. He led Valor out of the stall each day, the lead rope loose in his hand, his steps slow enough for the stallion to mirror without strain. At first, it was only a few paces down the barn aisle, the scent of fresh air stirring Valor's ears forward. Then, as strength returned, they ventured into the paddock, where the ground was still soft from the melt. The stallion would pause often, testing each step, his breath flaring white in the chill. Ethan never hurried him. One afternoon, the sound of voices carried over the fence. Clara, a teenage neighbor with wind-tangled hair, leaned on the gate, her younger brother Jonah beside her. Jonah was small for his age, his voice hesitant, catching slightly on certain words. Clara nodded toward the horse. "That's him, isn't it? The one from the race?" Ethan only gave a brief nod. Jonah clutched a rolled-up magazine, the cover showing a photo of Valor in mid-stride, mane flying. Without prompting, he began to read from the article inside, the words halting but determined. Valor's ears flicked toward the boy's voice. Step by step, he closed the distance to the fence, lowering his head until his muzzle nearly brushed the paper. Jonah's grin was small but unguarded, and Ethan found himself watching the boy as much as the horse. There was a likeness there. Two creatures learning how to trust again, each cautious in their approach. The visits became routine. Clara would help muck stalls while Jonah read, or offered apple slices through the rails. Ethan noticed the way Valor stood differently when the boy was near, a softness in his stance that had not been there before. For his part, Ethan began speaking more, telling Jonah about the way horses learn from stillness, about the first time he'd ever watched a foal stand, about the fire without giving the details that still caught his throat. Progress was uneven. Some mornings Valor walked freely, his steps smooth and steady. Other days, a misstep or sudden twinge would bring them to a halt. Ethan adjusted without complaint, circling back to the barn if needed, waiting for the stallion's confidence to return. He'd learned long ago that forcing a pace never won a race worth running. Then came the day he decided to try a light trot. The sky was clear, the ground firm enough to offer footing but soft enough to cushion. He walked Valor to the far side of the paddock, gave a slight cue, and stepped forward. The stallion followed, the first few strides tentative, then quicker. For a moment, Ethan saw the echo of the horse in that magazine, proud, powerful, certain. But halfway around, Valor stumbled, his injured leg folding just enough to threaten collapse. Ethan was at his side in 2 steps, one hand steadying the lead, the other braced against his shoulder. The air was still, the only sound the stallion's heavy breaths. Slowly, Valor straightened. He shifted his weight, found his balance, and took another step. Then another. They finished the circuit at a walk, the pace unhurried but unbroken. When they reached the gate, Jonah was grinning, an apple slice ready in his outstretched hand. Valor took it gently, chewing with a contentment that filled the quiet. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't victory, not in the way the world measured it, but it was enough, more than enough. And for the first time in years, he felt the faint pull of something he'd once believed was gone: hope. By late spring, the ranch had shed its winter silence. Grass rose in fresh shoots along the fence lines, and wildflowers traced yellow and white against the green. The air carried the scent of earth warmed by sun, and the paddock, once marked by slow, tentative steps, now held the steady rhythm of a horse finding himself again. Valor's gait was still uneven, but it bore a strength that had not been there before, a quiet defiance against what was once certain doom. Ethan leaned on the fence one afternoon, watching the stallion move under the open sky. Jonah was there too, magazine tucked under one arm, his eyes following each step with unguarded admiration. Clara rested her chin on the top rail, squinting into the light. "You should let people see him," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, as if stating something obvious. Ethan's brow furrowed. "He's not for show." Clara shook her head. "Not for a ribbon. For proof." The idea sat with him for days. He turned it over while mucking stalls, while repairing a loose board in the barn, while brushing the dust from Valor's coat in the long evening light. It wasn't about showing the stallion's worth the world. It was about showing the world that worth could survive even after it was written off. When he finally decided, it was without announcement. The county fair was modest, nothing like the crowded roar of a racetrack. Still, the show ring drew a few dozen onlookers, locals with paper cups of lemonade, children leaning over the fence. As Ethan led Valor in, the murmurs began, a ripple of recognition, the name passing from one voice to another. The stallion's head was high, ears alert, each step deliberate. He wore no racing tack, just a plain halter, the scarred leg moving without falter. Jonah stood at the edge of the rail, magazine clutched tight, his small frame nearly swallowed by the crowd. Clara's hand rested on his shoulder, steadying him against the press of bodies. The announcer's voice carried over the field, recounting the story, how Valor had fallen, the decision to end his life, and the man who refused to let him go. The words were stripped of spectacle, told plainly, but the weight in them was enough to still the noise around the ring. Ethan walked Valor in a slow circuit, letting the stallion set the pace. He could feel the strength in the lead rope, the steady pull of muscle and will. By the time they reached the starting point again, the crowd was clapping, some faces wet with tears they didn't bother to hide. After the show, Ethan didn't linger. He loaded Valor into the trailer, the warm hum of applause still echoing in his ears. The drive home was quiet, the windows down, spring air curling through the cab. Back at the ranch, the sky was painted in the burnished colors of dusk. Ethan opened the pasture gate without a word. Valor stood still for a moment, his dark eyes scanning the open field. Then, with a toss of his head, he moved forward, first at a walk, then into a gallop. It wasn't flawless. The rhythm carried a subtle hitch where the injury had left its mark. But it was free, and it was his. Ethan watched from a fence, the boards rough under his hands. Jonah and Clara stood nearby, the boy's grin wide enough to catch the fading light. The stallion's mane caught the wind, the sun breaking across his back until it seemed he carried a light with him. For a long while, none of them spoke. There was no need. The truth was there in the field. A life refused to be discarded, a strength reclaimed. Ethan felt the weight in his chest ease, replaced by something steady and certain. They had not just saved a horse. They had salvaged a part of themselves. As the last of the sunlight bled into the horizon, Valor slowed, turning his head toward them as if to mark their place in his world. Ethan lifted a hand in quiet acknowledgement. In that stillness, it was clear this was not an ending, but the start of a new race neither of them had expected to run.